3 contributions from opening government. First of all, explaining why improving is not actually that important. I'm going to set up that. Secondly, why buying this land is the most important thing for protection. And third of all, some way to explain why any sort of harms that they want to sort of protect are probably quite a marginal return compared to the very concrete and sort of high impact claims that we're going to bring in. First of all, and a little bit of setup. First of all, why? What do we think this sort of extra security measure actually looks like? We think it looks like hiring a couple more rangers, things like clearing trees, things like building new infrastructure such as toilet blocks or like picnic areas or things like that. Note here that the amount of sort of like rangers and stuff that you would put into that are probably quite a small amount of a marginal sort of extra amount to what is currently, and I will prove to you why what is going on currently is quite sufficient. Secondly, we would note that sort of any programs that are to do with like science, like for example, having like scientists come in to like monitor like the endangerment of like particular flora or fauna in the area or things like that would not be covered by like national park agencies, but rather will be covered by different government bodies and things like that, which specifically implement these sort of things on their own terms. I can take any points of clarification if any of that doesn't make sense. First of all then, why improving is not actually that important. First of all, we would prefer that we just protect, to stop development and things is probably the most important way. It looks like things like stopping apartments getting built in these areas, which is like, no thank you, which is likely to come because of urban sprawl and things like that. It means like stopping urbanization in very important areas of an environmental fragility, these important spaces for cultural groups, for indigenous peoples. Stopping that in development is the first step to protecting these people's sort of cultural history, but also the environment before irreversible damages is put onto these communities and environments. Second of all, we think that the most important work is actually just driven by the most important work that they want to talk about is probably already driven by volunteers in the first place. There is sort of few extra expenses that you need to buy off like new ranges and things like that. We think on our side, at the point at which you get like buying lots of new land, and because of that sort of I'll explain later about why this probably would involve better public support and is sort of good capital for things like, let's like save the koalas and stuff, then rather than the need for development. It means that you get sort of more volunteers and stuff on our side. No thank you compared to sort of the little amount that they're going to get. Third of all, we'd explain that improvement is often reversible on their side. Things like littering and stuff can obviously be collected by these volunteers and things like that. Compare this to the benefits that we bring you. Like cutting down forests is obviously something that cannot be reversed, no thank you. That is extremely harmful to the environment. Development obviously stifles this sort of stuff. It is not the point at which bush rangers and stuff can just fix those things. It actually, like the harms that we're able to stop because of the development means that more ecosystems don't get ruined, they don't get completely stifled into the long term. At the end of this, you should believe that if like improving on their side yields a very marginal return, because just having a few more bush rangers there is probably going to result in quite a meaningless effort. No thank you. Secondly, the damages that we stop are very much certain. It's things like when you cut down like a few hectares of trees to build like a new infrastructure and things like that. We stop that. Obviously, this is huge impact into the future because it means that the environment is indefinitely like protected on our side. We also think that any sort of bought land and stuff will be stabilized with volunteering. Would be established with like volunteer programs with bush regeneration projects in the first place, because that's the sort of capital that you need after you sort of buy huge amounts of land. I'll take you in a moment. And finally, to say that the capital for sort of things like I said before about like saving the koalas and things like versus the need for development would probably garner quite a lot of public support. It emphasizes the importance of that protection is the thing that we need to do. It's the thing that we ought to be obligated to do, and it means that you probably get more volunteers and things like that as a result. I think your point.
Is it actually good for many parts of the world to say buy up tracts of land to stop dense housing being built?
Yes. Because, like, obviously you're not going to take down all the bushes, right? It's just like getting more protected areas is obviously a good thing. Like, you're not going to build out like the entire countryside on these certain parts. You probably want to just have more parts that are protected. Alright, second point then about why buying land is the most important thing for protection. First of all, we think that uniquely buying now is way more important than leaving this into the future, because it means right now it is relatively cheap, because a lot of these areas are unproductive. They've been untouched by the things that they want to talk about, things like dense like housing population, because of things like urban sprawl. That means that into the future, these prices are not going to be as cheap as they are right now. Because of things like sprawl, they're going to get massively expensive. And at the point at which damage is getting increasingly irreversible, it's a lot harder to actually start up those programs and to buy that new land at the point at which it is too expensive to buy. Secondly, we look at this damage is literally irreversible. Once you start all this development, you can't just undevelop any of that infrastructure, any of those buildings and things like that. We'd rather not have those things built in the first place. Secondly, we think that the environmental damage is completely irreversible, right? It's things like killing habitats. It means that endangered animals continue to get more endangered. Yes, you can do things like endangered programs and things for those animals and things like that, but that's so much harder at the point at which they are already endangered. We'd rather sort of stop that in the first place, but we would still obviously have things like endangerment programs, but it would be more effective on our side when you have less endangered animals in the first place. Thirdly, we think that it would be easier to set up these things preemptively. When you have things like cultural spaces already built into this land, when you have like indigenous education, establishments and things like that for school groups to come through and things like that, you would have a lot more of those things in the first place before these things are too late and you come in after. So we think that those are likely to be set up as you buy this land. What are the impacts of this? Obviously, we've explained to you that these impacts, these harms to the environment, to the land, to the culture are irreversible. We explained to you that the improvement at the point at which you're just getting a few more ranges and things like that to that land in the first place is going to yield very marginal returns. We explained to you very long-term impact of that it is harder to get the land the more you wait into this in the future. The environment ought to be protected right now. We've even pushed for things like the environment not being touched at all without any human interaction, because these habitats deserve to thrive, because we can adjust to them into the future before they get damaged irreparably in the first place. We would believe that this less development is a good thing for these sort of habitats. We don't need to support the entire environment getting protected, but the more environment that we do protect, the more environment that does not have to face this irreparable damage is a good thing. We think that the stuff that happens on their side is probably sufficient on our side when you have volunteers and stuff doing work like collecting littering and things like that. But things like at the point at which you cut down trees and having to build them up again is a lot more harder than any of the improvements that they want to talk about. Okay.
Thank the Prime Minister for their speech. I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
It's kind of weird that I have to start there, but let's ask ourselves where national parks exist. 'Cause the Prime Minister thinks they exist right next to cities, and they're probably kind of small, so we need to spend lots of money to make them bigger. National parks are often incredibly enormous, and they're often relatively far away from cities. And we'll do this debate in the context in which they think the threat is putting apartment blocks in areas that otherwise might be koala habitats, but it's probably just not most of the debate. This debate also occurs in the fucking developing world. It's also about things like protecting endangered species from things like poaching, not just apartment blocks. Huge amount of setup. First, how do national parks get set up? Because I think the confusing thing about the Gov Bench is they have to defend using a technique that doesn't really get used in the establishment of national parks in the status quo. And it's because national parks are usually land given to these agencies by the government directly, and they're not usually things they actually buy out themselves. So we'll give them the legal dubiousness that the OG never clarifies. It's unclear if an agency buys land if it actually would be part of a national park. We'll concede it is to make their Gov Bench work, but I think OG probably should have attempted to prove that. But it also explains that if we're able to prove that we get additional political capital by running national parks properly, we also can get expansions in the amount of land that is provided to us via political capital.
Point of clarification.
Sure.
Surely your side of the debate would necessitate that you spend that political capital on development, not expansions.
Because the difference here is the funding the agency has, which is the preferred part of the debate. If the government gives you additional land, but via no lobbying of your own, we'll concede that. We're not making our case contingent on winning in this way, though. We're happy to do the debate winning that way, but we'll also point out that this is not the only way of doing it. Okay, second clarifying question. Who are you buying this land off? And this is where the introduction is most problematic for OG, because they're it is just about buying land that otherwise get developed into kind of apartments. I think it is far more likely people that either want to log that area for forestry, it's people that want to mine in that area, or it is people that want to instead have their farms in those areas because they are national parks tend to be in more rural contexts. We'll concede it is also people wanting to put apartments in here. The big problem for OG is this policy by necessity then has to be enormously expensive because someone is using that land in some way that's probably profitable otherwise. Which means they're probably fairly unwilling to sell this land, and we'll concede again they do, but obviously that means they push the prices up a fair bit. And that means the kind of difference in bargaining power that each actor has here. Like the national park can't really go ask someone else to buy that land off them. It is owned by a single person. Which means they know they can extract a huge amount of money for them. Which means the claims here they make, well, like land will get more expensive to buy. No, you just can't buy it. There's houses there. It's still very expensive to buy it right now. So I don't think you actually explain this policy is particularly cheap. The final thing, second last thing to do instead is just to explain how land is generally protected outside of national parks, because it is not that national parks are the only way we protect pieces of land to do the thing they talk about here of like keeping enough trees around and protecting endangered species. And that's just like non-federal governments do lots of things to protect them otherwise. They do things like just not giving zoning permits to build apartments, not allowing forestry permits or mining permits. And again, this is outside of the debate. We're not fixing this in any way. The status quo has a predetermined desire to keep a certain amount of forests around, keep a certain amount of endangered species around, and not mean there's mines right next to cities if this is this team's win condition. So there's a reasonable amount of protection that occurs, and it is not only national parks that do this. The final thing to talk about what we do instead, there's a lot of hand waving from Jade about you'll get 2 ranges or something like that. You're buying acres and acres of land off forestry and mining people. You've got a lot of money. It means we also have some amount of money to spend for this, not just on 1 or 2 more ranges, but probably quite a lot more of them, improving a lot of things like campsites and trails and kind of cultural mapping, mapping of cultural sites and protecting those sorts of things as well. The final thing they do here is they're like, well, you can't spend money on scientists because governments would do that otherwise. I think we are talking about protecting the national park and the facilities, and if we require scientific advice to do so, we probably are allowed to do this. I don't really understand this burden push, but also it's just half the people that work at these agencies are ecologists already. I don't know, that's already happening. So that's weird thing on that. Cool, go.
Do you support facilitating more tourism of these lands on your sites?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously. We do it in sustainable ways, run by, people that care about protecting things. I'll talk about why a better signing leads to a better protection. If your case is just, no one should go to the national park, fucking lame. Chris Richards, you're a fucking judge. You're not going to win the debate on that claim, right? Let's first talk about why national parks are particularly bad at protecting the land and the animals that exist in there already. And I would note that the problem with this argument for the Gulf bench is, of course, if they have additional land, then the problems I'm about to explain are going to get worse as they have to monitor more land. What are the problems that these agencies deal with right now? They deal with people coming in and just kind of logging parts of the national park on the kind of edges because they don't think that the agencies will go and check it. They do things like poachers coming in and killing animals and taking off with them. And the problem with these activities is it's not like you can put a fucking security camera in every part of the national park. They're very, very hard to manage. Incredibly large amounts of land, you can't manage them yourself by having people there or CCTVs or whatever. And the people who might, on random chance occasionally, run into someone who's doing some logging that they shouldn't, run into someone who's poaching or something like that, it's very hard for them to then enforce that behavior. It's very hard for them to keep them up in land. If it's a fucking poacher, they've got guns, they can just threaten you instead. But also the agency workers who are the rangers this team is talking about, sure, we can pay them a bit more and stuff, but these people aren't paid enormous amounts, especially in the developed world. So if they see a poacher and they offer a bribe, or that poacher just threatens them with a gun, they're not really going to put their life in the line of the rhino or the animal that they're trying to protect, koalas, if this is the government's case, which means the enforcement's done particularly poorly. Even then, if you do find evidence of these misbehaviors occurring, and I point out why you're unlikely to do so, the enforcement that you're talking about is pretty hard here. Either it is getting in the way of someone with a gun, or more likely just just trying to sue Forestry in New South Wales or some shit like that. Pretty hard to do. They're pretty well off, and lots of lobbying power and profitability means they're pretty willing to spend lots of money to try and defend these things. Which means the amount of protection that does occur to the koalas, to the forests, all those sorts of things that the government has to defend is pretty poor in the status quo, and it's probably just likely to get worse in the status as you get more land to protect. The second thing I will note here is that the poorly maintained facilities that we're talking about, that we are able to improve, are quite poor, but more likely to improve in our world. The first thing is, people are just not particularly likely to go to a national park if things like the campsite is poorly maintained, if there's no trails, if there's no map, those sorts of things. And that means that when less people go, they provide less funding, because of course you need national park, you need to pay to get into a national park, or you need to have some sort of like sticker or whatever. And it's more likely when you don't have sufficient signage and stuff like that, and the campsite looks shit, you're more likely to generally have a perception this place is not very well looked after, it's not very important, and not pay a whole bunch of attention to it and respect for it. Which means if you have more people coming in and you have to pay and you're able to look after things much better, then you both get a virtuous cycle of additional funding, of additional political capital, and the land is just generally looked after because people understand it better and they understand what they're looking at, rather than just like trampling over a cultural site because they don't understand what it is, because they can't read the sign because it's so old. Very proud of those.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. A round of applause.
I'm going to start this speech by dealing with the only real defence that they have for what their side prefers, which is continuing to improve the development of existing national parks. They say that national parks are hard to manage, and like they will get logged, poachers will come in. But obviously literal deforestation is the easiest thing to catch that you need the fewest rangers to do. And so that stuff was probably not too likely to happen on our side. But also we think things that we can do very easily without using any capital, like increasing fines or whatever, mean that we can deter this to a large extent. What else do we tell you? We tell you that when land is a national park, it is already protected in the most important way in that it is not developed. We say that volunteers will come in and do a lot of the important work that they do, and that the damage here is super irreversible. But the final thing that I'll add here is that existing facilities are good, and that we can implement the existing facilities in national parks that are already here today into the new national parks that we purchase. The op bench must defend improving facilities in existing national parks. We'll explain why they are good now, because right now, national parks want visitors for revenue. That means they're likely to do things like make sure the facilities at least somewhat good. They say that the individual incentive of people who manage, but also the individual incentive of people that manage national parks is to make them quite good now, and that they care about making revenue, but also they care about their national park, that area that they live in, and their job. But the final thing that we can do here is co-opt their benefit. And the premise here is very simple, because when we can no longer buy land because it's expensive or because we've got it all or whatever, then to whatever extent development is beneficial, we can do it at that point. We explain this debate is about what we prefer doing in the present, and why buying land is something that we're more able to do today, and this is something that prevents irreversible damage, whereas we explain the harms that they talk about, that they can solve with increased security and whatever, are things that are relatively reversible compared to the development of this land. And that is why we can do it at a later point. Yeah, I'll take on.
Is the extinction of the black rhino reversible? Like, you guys just can't just say, "I'll burn it a bunch of times" and claim you don't defend it. We will give more machetes to the anti-poaching gangs.
Yeah, but obviously, in those, the developing world frame, I think, is a bit silly, because obviously the capital was really limited in those areas, and that most of the protection of rhinos that happens is done through things like charities anyway, which means that we do it the same. And probably charities are more likely to step in if it is true that we're decreasing funding to existing security. Obviously, that isn't working. What we also explain is that when we are able to protect more land, we're able to protect more rhinos, and that was something that was better. The final thing I'll do here is a new piece of substantive that is explaining that the type of development that this op bench has to support is bad. Because, note they're developing already existing national parks. This looks like clearing trees for picnic spots. This looks like building barbecue areas and toilet blocks. And it does mean, like they say, more people in these national parks visiting. But that means things like more littering, despite increased protection. You don't have less of these problems when you have more rangers, to the point at which you have more visitors. I think this is really important, because visitors deteriorate ecological health, they endanger animals, they pollute, etc. Ower explains that for us. Preempting their, they're responding to their point, but they're like, oh, we have more money because more visitors. Obviously, that was silly, at the point at which A, we explain that the money they spend isn't useful, but also the fact that we don't think that people visit national parks and give that money because there's a new fucking toilet block or whatever. Obviously, people will visit the same rate. We have the same development that they have in existing national parks. We just have these new ones as well. So it was never true that we would have less capital for these things on our side. On to then, why we explain buying is super important. We say that you protect more land. We explain this is harder to do into the future. They're like, oh no, the government will give it to you, and that's the way that national parks can get this. Obviously, the land that the government gives us is symmetric, but note also they don't do this as much anymore. And the national parks that were established like 100 years ago, where there was like where the land had far less utility to the government, are things that exist and continue today. But it's not like the government is continuing to give out more land. That is how we're able to get more into the future. They're like, oh, the government won't, or like you don't need national parks to prevent this development and whatever. Because like the government just won't give you development permits. But obviously those decisions that are made by individual, like local councils and governments into the future is not the security that we promise. Because the difference is when you have a national park, that land will never be developed. And if someone tries to take away the title of a national park from it, they're under massive public scrutiny and everyone cares. But if you just have some undeveloped land that like, oh, there's this culture of this council not letting governments develop, that isn't the same, or like that is something that can be easily undone into the future, and so they're unable to claim the benefit that we explained. Yes, Will?
So, what do you think uses huge amounts of land in rural areas that are currently not very populated?
Okay, so this is also responding to that thing that Tom's like, oh, well, like, there's no apartment blocks in these areas, not near cities. But obviously, as populations grow, people expand out anyway. But even if you don't believe that, obviously it is true that this land is utility for other things like farming, things like industry, that can also take place in other areas. The distinction is that we protect those specific lands, right? Because they have endangered species, because they have cultural significance. And those are things that we uniquely solve. Because there is culturally significant land, and there is land with endangered species that are at risk of going extinct that is not protected now, and we uniquely are able to buy up that land. When they're like, oh, you don't have that much money to buy land or whatever, also reduces what they do. But no, we only need to buy certain areas of land that are of specific importance. So this also responds when they're like, oh, it's bad to buy it all because like you need development. I think firstly, the developing world frame they used here was a bit stupid because obviously the capacity, as I explained there, means you can buy less anyway, and that the most important conservation work isn't done by governments and national parks anyway. But secondly, obviously we're not buying all the land. We buy the most important land, recognizing that our capital is limited. No government will let you buy states of land. We buy areas of specific cultural significance. We buy area with like endangered species. We protect land from deforestation. And those are things that were uniquely important into the long term and things that we were able to secure in a way that they just couldn't, right? They developed land that's already done. And on the cultural protection, final thing in this speech, because probably some places closing half can take this debate, how should you weigh this? What opening government brings you is a clear and concrete benefit of protecting certain areas of land from the most devastating types of harm into the long run. It meant that people had their culturally significant land secured for them into the future. It meant that there were areas, it meant that farms and industry would set up in areas where there weren't endangered species, a benefit that we're able to claim. And it meant that you stopped national parks becoming touristy areas with increased development where they put the money that we have, and that meant those areas were better off anyway. Vote OG.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I'll deal with the question of where this debate takes place, then I'll explain why this is an expensive and unpopular policy, and lastly I'll explain why this will lead to a direct increase in poaching and other kinds of harms that befall land that belongs to national parks. Firstly, let's explain where this debate takes place. Extremely weird and honestly bordering on offensive claim from opening government that the developing world frame thing of this debate is stupid. Obviously takes place in enormous parts of the developing world, and I'll explain why. In the developed world, there is the smallest delta for this policy. That is to say that lots of the land that could be developed developed, already has been developed. That's to say that there are the greatest other exogenous mechanisms for the environmentalist movement and people who are aligned with the kind of interests that these guys say that national parks have to protect land in other ways. It is where governments are the most democratic and the most sensitive to, for instance, lobby and interest groups that say that you should not develop on this piece of land, that you should not treat this piece of land in this way. The largest delta in this debate absolutely does come in the developing world, where you do have large, for instance, like land-intensive sets of farming that still need to occur, where you still have practices like poaching, where you still have practices like non-compliance with governmental regulations that means that the negative externalities done by developing any one piece of land necessarily larger. And that is where the opening opposition does the debate. We say that when you're trying to protect land that you already have, it actually requires quite a lot of capital, and therefore a lot of the time they're not that good at doing it. We also do the thing of talking about developed world national parks. Like, I've been to Yellowstone, it's beautiful. It costs a lot to maintain. It costs a lot to make sure that people have a positive experience and encounter with the environment that means that they actually care about protecting those national parks. No, thank you. Let's secondly explain why this is an expensive and unpopular policy and what that ultimately means, because both of these government bench teams have clearly woefully misunderstood an argument about political capital or about goodwill for these national parks. What this means is that if our policy is less expensive and less unpopular, not only can we do more things with that money, like we can just do vastly more. These guys say, well, they never say all of the rangers are fine, like we just need to pay the rangers a little bit more. That is fucking ridiculous. We literally say that we will put more armed patrols on the borders of the Serengeti National Park to stop people going in there and poaching. Insane for this team to claim that the stuff that we can do is not also intensive in resources and time, but we explain that when national parks function better at what we understand to be their key functions, that is providing visitors with experiences that are, yes, sustainable, that are meaningful to them, that allow them to experience those national parks and all they have to offer, and yes, generate revenue both for themselves and tourist revenue for those states, and do things like protect endangered animals. When they are more popular, they get given more land. They get given more money in the long term. This is not actually a strict trade-off or a zero-sum game. It is capital generating. Don't know why that's a foreign concept to this bench. Firstly, let's explain why it's more expensive. We firstly explained that this is absolutely not the norm for how national parks acquire land. And that honestly just means that, I don't know what these guys think the coffers of a national parks agency look like. Chris, you probably have a better idea of what they look like. Actually, just unclear that they have an enormous amount of capital lying around at any one time to make, say, a gigantic purchase like a tract of vulnerable land. These guys say, well, no, we're just protecting small and vulnerable pieces of land. No explanation for why that actually does anything. They talk about deforestation. In order to protect a period of a tract of land from significant deforestation, you do actually need to buy an enormous tract of land. So no, do not buy the nonsense characterization that we're just going to buy small cultural sites and small particularly vulnerable pieces of land. Those do not exist. We secondly explain that land that's worth protecting by the metrics of the government bench is expensive, because even if it is far away, you need some capacity for visitors to get to it. So it can't be literally in plonk in the middle of a continent, and often means that you need to spend additional money making sure visitors can get to that park, because that is how they make their money. And also the OG characterization talks about apartment blocks not being built, valuable farming not taking place. So you're just admitting that you are competing with private sector and industry who desperately, for their own livelihood, need to develop that land, which drives up the cost of that land, which means this is a very expensive policy. Secondly, on why it's an unpopular policy, this is a massive pain in the ass for any regulatory agency, this set of behavior. You do also rely on government for some funding, especially if these guys are just going to fence off nonsensically placed pieces of land that nobody can visit and nobody can enjoy, because there are no trail markings, there are no campsites, there are no educators that are there to tell people about the species that are there. So you do actually rely on their funding, and you provide direct contrary incentives to the incentives of governments to develop, honestly, somewhat sustainably on those pieces of land as well, because it is required for industry, because it is required for expansion. Secondly, though, they're not revenue generating. They don't generate any revenue from tourists. They mean that it's not a nice experience for people who go there. And lastly, and this is the most bananas characterization from this team, is that they're going to buy up culturally significant indigenous sites. Did not ever stop to ask whether the indigenous groups wanted them to do that or had no other way of protecting that land themselves. I don't know. The indigenous people I've met generally do not like it when governments buy up their land for no reason. I'll take closing.
Are you okay with your armed guards killing the poachers?
Yes. Yes,
and they do very frequently, and we say power to them. Like, yeah, literally they do kill the poachers, and they are, like, honestly largely, like, volunteers, and people who put themselves in harm's way and in incredibly dangerous situations. We will spend any amount of money that is required to protect the people who kill poachers. Let's explain lastly why you lead to an increase in poaching and in other harms. Well, you should weigh this very highly in the debate, because I've explained that this is a phenomenon that occurs where the largest delta for the debate occurs, which is in the developing world, where there is the weakest exogenous regulations like weapons regulations and those kinds of things, and there is the highest direct economic incentive to do so. We explained that there are devastating ecosystem harms that are often entirely unpredictable. Look, for instance, what happened to Yellowstone when the wolf was removed because it was a keystone species, led to environmental and ecological collapse. We engage with you thoroughly, Tim. Stop being annoying. And we've explained that those harms are unpredictable and they are permanent. The fight against, we give you two explanations for why this leads to an increase in poaching and other harms. Firstly, explain that the fight against poaching is extremely onerous. Like, I think this is most accurately characterized as a fight that is being lost already, right? Like, animals are being driven to extinction. They're being sold on the black market. They're having their horns ground into powder for black market medicine. Like, that is a harm that is happening right now. It is acutely dangerous to rangers. Poachers are much better funded than the rangers because of how profitable and lucrative the industry is. It's very onerous and time intensive to patrol borders, to get into armed altercations, to monitor population numbers, and it is often done by people who are like either volunteers or minimally paid. And that just means that the giant money pit that opening government turns this debate into can actually be put to very good use. Yes, even in the developing world where there is still money that exists, like Tanzania can still spend money protecting the Serengeti, Kenya can still spend money protecting its national parks. We secondly just explain that there is a direct trade-off between trying to protect more areas, spreading your ranges more thin, spreading all of that protection that you have more thinly, and protecting the areas that you currently have well, and all of the benefits that gives you to tourism, to protecting those species, making sure there is a national park that is there for future generations. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Welcome the Government Member.
Well, at the end of that opening, I offered you, aside from a very significant dump on OJ, unfortunately, very limited scope of actual benefits, you know. Things were going to be a bit nicer for the tourists. You were going to have a few more volunteers and perhaps they'll be paid a little bit more to kill the poachers and maybe political capital will go up. At CG, we have a bit more of a grand ambition for this debate. The first is that we'd like to bring you a few unique benefits which exclusively owning large pieces of land brings you, particularly lands at the borders of existing national parks. And secondly, we'd like to talk about the unique position governments are in to own land but lease it to private management, thereby imposing environmental protections, yielding lots of economic benefits from the economic activity on that land, and creating better incentives by which government is more able to police other people's environmental management land rather than its own. And that would be the main focus of our extension. But first, just a few unique pieces of analysis about land in particular. There are a few things which require land en masse as opposed to just very well protected pieces of land. Oh, clarification, go for it.
So are these new parts of land part of the national park or just something
Yeah, they're part
of the land?
But both. They're existingly owned and new parts, but obviously the new parts will give us increased capacity. I promise I'll explain it, you can hear what I mean, yeah. The first is that often animals require migration paths which require them to move from pieces to the other, and oftentimes national parks are in a position right now where they're disconnected and there are lack of land corridors and things for the animals to move from, for example, one national park to the other. We propose buying up such land corridors such that we can re-establish migration patterns which have currently been disrupted. The second thing as well is that this kind of engages their poaching material because it gives the animals, for example, more unique places to hide from poachers. It allows them to be deeper into the national park, so it's even more difficult for poachers to get their vehicles in there and stuff like that. Secondly, there are certain ecosystems which share biomasses with bordering privately owned land. So a really good example of this would be like CEO was really questioning like, where are we buying this land from? This is like farms. So for example, lots of land in national parks right now shares a water table with a neighbouring farm such that the irrigation efforts by the privately owned land end up depleting the water table in the national park. Whereas the really only solution to this, because of the difficulties OO pointed out with, failures of regulation, is to just own the land. So we would propose, for example, buying up farmland which is adjacent to our national park, who's currently depleting our shared biomasses, so that we actually prepare it, saving the biodiversity, because no amount of rangers patrolling the border will stop the water from seeping out right from under you. So those are the two kind of unique things which you can only do with land. No amount of rangers will help you. Now on to the main focus of our extension, which is going to be about the leasing to private. So lots of people, when they think of national parks, they think of just this really unused land, which is that's not really what it is. Like in the real world, for those who know, right? Like Perisher Ski Resort is on a national park, right? Red Energy, that dam, lies on a national park. Many places which are these big capitalist investments are on national parks. And what they have managed to do over a long period of time is generate a shit ton of money from the market. They've managed to generate a shit ton of money for the government because the government has quite expensive lease premiums on this land. But also, you will notice that there has been very minimal construction despite the increasing popularity of the ski industry in places like Perisher, because the government is very, very good at enforcing management laws on other people, where it is not good at enforcing management laws on itself. And that is at the heart of our extension. What we say is that what they basically propose is a model of self-policing, that the government should just hang on to the land it's got and regulate it really well and invest in it really well. But the problem is, as things go on and budgets get tight and money needs to be cut, what we've seen with the problems of the bushfires, where, it turns out that we'd only done 60% of the recommended back burnings, or we hadn't done quite as much land clearing as we should have, or we were chronically understaffed for decades, is governments are very, very good over the long term of excusing their own mistakes, of pushing it to the next election. We got an inspection which said we didn't manage the land as well. Well, we just offer a new inspection, or we'll delay the inspection next time, or we'll question the results. And that's because it's not politically popular to put egg on your own face. And that is the model we're getting from this opposition bench. The model which says the government should regulate its own management of the land, it should own the land, it should do everything at once. Similarly speaking with tourism, government is not very good at being a tourism industry. It doesn't tend to put a huge amount of money in advertising, and when it does, we get where the bloody hell are you? It also tends to, for example, not be as good at, for example, putting the tourists in good places and giving them a good time, because governments aren't really Airbnbs, right? They're not set up well to offer tourists a good experience. So what tourists end up getting when they go to this land is a shabby, like basically what you'd expect by something run by the government. What we say instead is what the government should do is it should buy up as much land as possible in as many attractive natural settings and then lease it to private industry, and private industry will run these things. Here are the reasons why. On environmental management and enforcement, meeting targets is what businesses do best. When extra capital is needed to do the extra back burnings or to fill the short staffing, private industry can mobilise that capital. It can do things like offer share dividends, it can raise it from partner businesses, whereas governments need to go to committees and they need to actually pass legislation to mobilise extra money. Secondly, it's easy for governments to blame externally rather than internally. If we're only hitting 80% of the back burning requirement, the government can say, listen, when the next lease round comes up, your name is on the chopping block, we're going to lease to someone else who can do the job properly, whereas governments are very likely to forgive their own mistakes. Lastly, go for it.
Yeah, you act as though you're operating with the infinite capital of a government. This is specifically about national parks agencies who have substantially less capital to work with. So I guess you buy like one ski resort and maybe it makes you a bit more money.
Who runs the National Parks Agency again? Starts with a G. Government, obviously, right? This debate isn't about the intricacies of how you mobilise funds between government agencies. The debate is about, let's presume the government has a certain amount of money. Should they spend that money investing in buying more land or investing in their existing land? That's the debate. It's not about too much of debating works in the APS. It's not about that, right? On things like poaching. Poachers, like government is going to always run into barriers where it doesn't want its own employees summarily executing poachers, because there are lots of, for example, like media stories which go wrong. Whereas private security, well, that's a lot more tolerable if they kill people, because if things get a bit messy, the government can blame them. Likely with bribing, government servants are a lot more easy to bribe because their working conditions often aren't as good as they're quite underpaid. Private security, a lot harder to bribe, they have a lot more of that collegial, loyalty, and they're often better paid. Secondly, it's important that this way we can create narratives of national parks being revenue positive over the long term. It's a lot more politically palatable to spend money you get from a lease invested back in the environment, because it's like money coming from the bush being reinvested back in the bush. Whereas when they're doing it the way they want to do it, you have to mobilise those funds from other areas like schools, hospitals, and other stuff like that. Lastly, with non-compliance of environmental regulations, as I always said, we don't have much leverage when we're trying to regulate externally, whereas when you own the land, you have infinite access to the land, so you're not restricted by private ownership, and you can threaten your lease by offering the lease to another person who's going to be more competitive with complying with the regulations. Very proud to propose.
Awesome. I thank the government member. I'd like to welcome the opposition member.
I'm going to firstly provide you 2 extensions, then explain why closing opposition just doesn't really make sense, then go through the opening half. Firstly, on our 2 extensions. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that this land, quite simply, is needed for other things that are much more important than the parks themselves. And this is 2 things. Firstly, often agriculture is just particularly important. It is quite important for people to have food. And then having this land being able to use for agriculture is important, and when you give it to a park, you lose that benefit. The second benefit that we get is things like solar and renewables. And this is for the reason that these require lots of land, and it requires that land to be in rural areas, places that do have lots of sun, places like that are deserts, and places that already exist quite near national parks. The reason this is particularly important in this debate is because these things are just directly impactful on humans themselves, people that we care about, as well as that it is particularly important into the long term. And the reason it exists within this debate is because these areas are the ones that are most likely to be near national parks, but also the ones that we brought up. So this responds to what open government is probably trying to say, which is they're only buying specific land, things like places with endangered species and cultural significance. So to respond to that, the reality is though, they are unlikely to do it in these areas. So at the point where you exist, where you actually need to buy this land to protect a species, it is because it needs to be used for something else. And they would only do that when there is no other place they could go to. This is the reason that it is just intensive. You do have to clear land. You do have to take out trees from the area. That takes capital, so the point where that is a risk that you are trying to protect yourself from, it is land that is important for other things. So for that reason, for the reason that if you need to protect this land, it is needed for other things, then that means that this land matters in this debate for reasons that aren't national parks and for reasons that we are able to claim. So in that way, even if for that reason, it is important for these other reasons. But as well as this, we're just waiting to say we care more about having things like renewables and having agriculture than endangered species. Like, fuck your random bird you care about. I probably care about having solar and things like that, and having food that gets put on people's tables. These are things we just care more about than random endangered species. They never actually impacted this claim. They're going to try and say it's important, but it just in reality isn't. So the other thing is that. The other thing as well is the fact that they claim that at some point this land will be used for development and things like houses. As our opening says, this is probably just more important, houses do matter. But as well as that, Earth just won't become one huge megacity. Obviously land will some land will just never be used for houses. So that sort of doesn't stand. So that brings to a close our first extension, which is that this land is going to be used for much more important things at the point where you need to protect it. So for those reasons that we should not put it towards a national park, we should put it towards other things that matter much more. But then secondly, now I'm going to explain why this is overall just worse for the land. And the first reason is that you are less able to maintain the land itself from things that are particularly damaging to it. This looks like things like wildfires. And this is simply for the reason that when you do have less land that you need to care for, it is much easier to protect it from things like wildfires. You do have less land that you need to do backburning on. And for that reason, it is just much more useful to have less land and be able to care for it much better and protect it from things that could cause all of the land to go down in flames. So for that reason, we care about having less land is important for protecting the land itself. But then the second way this results in worse land is for the reason that this doesn't actually solve the problem of having lots of people going into national parks. And this is for the reason that when people go into national parks in the opposition world, they are still centralized in the same areas. They still go to the places that are more popular. They go to the places that have the most facilities in comparison to other ones. They go to the places that are just better, the places that are more wild than places that were previously farmland. So for those reasons, people are still centralized in the same areas, but now you simply have less ability to support those areas. But it does that more people go to these areas for the reasons that opening government says. They talk about how you're going to have more people knowing about the parks and it gets more political capital for them. Obviously, that would also coincide with more people going to the parks and thinking that it's a good place to go as a tourist. So when more people go to these places and you simply have them going to the same places, you increase the harms you have of people going to national parks and to overrunning already low facilities. Whereas on the outside, we have the same amount of people going to these facilities, but we're able to improve the facilities, we're able to improve the campgrounds and make them more sustainable and better for the people that go to them. So, opening government makes the claim here that they can just put stuff into these new areas, but that's literally not the debate. You do not have the money to do this. Their side of the debate buys more land, and at the point where they have that more land, they can choose to improve the facilities, which is our debate, or they can buy more land. The opposition is defending a world in which when they have more money, they spend it on land rather than improving the facilities of the land that they have. So, they cannot claim that. So, for this reason, we are simply able to better improve the land that we have, and we're able to support it much better. The reason that is particularly important is because caring for this land is just deeply important. For the land that we already have, it is quite useful just to maintain it and to have wild spaces, to have places where people can go and experience nature and things like that. We think that is deeply important in the debate. So, now on closing opposition and why the claim doesn't really make sense. The reason the claim doesn't make sense is because their sort of main push is that they're going to buy land and then lease it back to the person they bought it from and make a profit, as though that's something that a rational actor would take. Why would someone sell their farmland to the government so that they could not make money on that farmland anymore? If the opposition wants to claim the benefits of also being able to have agriculture and also being able to have renewables and things like that, then they need to explain why someone would sell off land to the government and then buy it back for more than they sold it for and rent it when they could just own it themselves. This simply just doesn't make sense as a claim in this debate. So for that reason, it makes no sense as to why people would actually sell off their land for the reasons the opposition is claiming. I'll take your point of information.
You say it doesn't make sense, but Snow Hydro is one of Australia's largest electricity providers and has been operating effectively in national parkland for decades. And it's a lot easier for the government to regulate its environmental
Okay, so this makes sense in the claim that you would already use your existing national park land to give it to people, but it doesn't make sense why you would buy more land and then give it to people. Because your claim here is that there is a private place of land where someone could build hydro, and then they could do that properly, or they are doing that properly, and the government's like, hey, I'll buy it off for you and sell it to you for more, and I'll let you rent it. Why would someone take that deal? That just doesn't make fucking sense. So, the other thing that they claim is the government will get the government is bad at managing land. But this is, again, literally part of the debate. I'd like to introduce you the term fiat. Fiat is just allowing us to do this. We have the ability to improve the kind of regulation that exists in this area. That is part of our debate. But as well as that, if the opposition is true, that the government currently has the incentive to protect these lands, they can obviously just do it through things like permits. Their entire extension is just completely symmetric and doesn't make sense. Why would we simply just waste national parks money to do this? But as well as that, this is just the job of other federal bodies in most states. This looks like Bureau of Land Management land in America, which is for the purpose of leasing it out to private vendors. Obviously, this just doesn't make sense as an extension. The final thing that they claim is that animals can hide better from poachers. Obviously, that's a bit stupid. Animals are probably able to hide in these areas already. What matters is having the rangers to protect them. What matters is being able to stop the poachers themselves, and you will only able to do that when you have less land to protect. For those reasons, both side opposition.
Thank the opposition member. I'd like to welcome the government whip.
The biggest problem with the CO extension is they never actually prove that under their well, the natural incentive is to use this land for solar panels. Because the profit maximization strategy of this land being used right now is probably for things like mining. They have to prove an actual incentive for that to currently be used in solar panels when empirically it isn't. The more likely world where that land is used for solar panels is uniquely under the extension we give. Because it's only when the government buys up that land and then knows that there are strong incentives to lease it to make some profit, but also to engage in activities that don't ruin the environment, which is to say that if you lease it out to a mine, right, they'll just destroy the environment, which is against your interest. If you lease it out to a wind farm, for example, you can have some wind farms but still have a forest there, for example, or have some land or some plains there in which animals and ecosystems can thrive. Only under our world is the benefits of CO's extension actually enabled. But let's actually deal with it more analytically. The problem here is that a lot of the stuff they talk about doesn't actually apply. Because, for example, the kind of land that we're talking about is usually not suitable for agriculture. Because when you're buying up raw natural land, for example, large forests and all that kind of stuff, the effort you need to go through to clear that thing for agriculture is quite high. But also for things like renewable energy, there's huge structural limitations on how you can use renewable energy, which means that you're not actually putting it in like the middle of Australia in the country. That is because battery technology is quite nascent at the moment, which means it's unlikely that you're going to store all that energy and bring it to people's homes in the cities, unless you want to build like extremely long power lines, which are super expensive. And it is also the case that renewable energy is much more decentralized, which means that people are more likely building solar panels on top of their homes in the city, rather than getting power from a solar panel in Alice Springs or something like that. And obviously other forms of energy, such as like nuclear energy and all that kind of stuff, need to be near things like coasts and can't be in the middle of nowhere because they need water for their cooling systems. But as I explained, to the degree at which that stuff is important, we get that better. The second extension they explain is that they get better land management, which means that they can do things like prevent wildfires, which is totally contradictory to the aims and principles of their first extension of not caring about the environment, presumably. And obviously, we can obviously still do that better because it is easier to control the management of that land when you buy up that land and then impose conditions on private actors that you lease that out to. What are their rebuttals to our extension? Their only rebuttal is just like, this extension doesn't make sense. Why would someone like sell you land and then buy it back and then like rent it in the future? The fundamental mistaking of our extension is that firstly, we're talking about a set of different actors here, which is to say currently the users of that land are evil, perverse actors like miners and poachers and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And we're buying the land from them and then we're selling it to a different, more benevolent actor, which is to say someone who wants to run a dam or a ski resort, or someone who wants to just run a national park for general tourism or run some kind of reserve. But the second thing to say is that we're buying it for a set of large actors, which is to say it's not like there's someone running a dam and then we buy the dam and the land and then now we sell it back and rent it to them. It's more that this dam doesn't exist and rather this current land is built of like 500 different plots of different like farmers that are doing fishing and agricultural activities. And we buy the land from each of them and it's their incentive to sell that land because the government obviously offers a lot of money to buy that land that they can make a profit off. And then they collect that land and collate it and then lease it out to a dam which is able to generate a large amount of profit, but also means that you're not destroying that land in ways which are environmentally unsustainable. So, why is our extension the most important in this debate? The first thing to say is that we provide the most cogent explanation for why you should value one side of the more land versus more effective land trade-off. Because if you listen to opening half closely, it's actually not really clear how you should judge it. Because like, the trade-off is like, should we have like a small piece of land that protects 100 dinos, but like only 5% of them get poached? Versus should we have a larger piece of land that has 200 rhinos that we protect, but then 10% get poached? Like, it's just a maths question. It's very unclear how exactly you do the way up, except for intuitions about like, one's more effective or one's more, you know? The thing that we provide is a set of structural reasons as to why you actually need a critical mass piece of land in order to get exponential gains in terms of sustainability. The fact that we explain you need to connect environmental corridors in order to capture migration patterns. The fact that we can prevent the spillover of pollutants, because there's no point having a piece of like a river being protected if upstream there's a company that's dumping all its toxic waste. Like, you obviously need to buy up all of that river to get the most of the benefits of that environmental protection. But the second extension we explain is the facilitation of private investment. This is extremely important for two reasons. Firstly, it massively mitigates a lot of OO's harms about the cost of this operation, which is something OG cost, because the only thing they're doing with this land, presumably, is just like letting it sit there, which is obviously not what happens in the status quo. In status quo, because it is costly, governments have strong incentives to lease that land out in ways that are quite effective and quite profit maximizing. And that allows the introduction of a private actor that's far more efficient and innovative, but also accountable in the way that they generate revenue on this land. But also, we provide the most salient mechanism for how accountability is generated, because when a government has responsibility over land, over managing it, when the land goes to shit, when poachers are going on it, government will just fudge the numbers. Government will just lower on their election agenda. And given that national parks is very low down on the list of things that we care about on the political smorgasbord of things that might turn elections, this is never an incentive that actually protects this land. But it's different when there's a separate private actor that the government can keep accountable. The government can say, you have these KPIs to protect these animals, you have these KPIs to reduce your pollution, and that means that private actor has all the unpopular incentives to do the things that otherwise would be unpopular for governments, such as raising ticket prices or closing the national park for a day to do some backburning. I'll take a point from OO.
Your opening says that you'll protect this land from development. Where are you getting CG fiat from? Like, did you forget the rules of debate?
This is not development. Development in the way that OG talks about it is like apparently like building apartments, which is something that is happening on the other forms of land. We're talking about things that are obviously compatible with the use of that land as a national park. Like the Snowy Hydro Dam takes up a very small amount of space of the Great Murray Basin or wherever the fuck it's located, and it's obviously massively profit generating. And the point is, the counterfactual is that that land is never bought, and instead there's miners destroying and hunting down those forests under your side. Alright, lastly on OO. They have two arguments. Firstly, enforcement issues, obviously uncomparative to the fact that this land is otherwise logged, but also our extension uniquely responds to this because we provide the accountability incentives for those private corporations to care for that, like private mercenary armies that hunt down those poachers. Secondly, they say political capital, but we explain that corporate provides innovative incentives to build in more things like tourism. Lastly, they just try to vibe control on like developing world impacts, which obviously is less important because their total capital is lower. But secondly, it's not really it's not really like a lot of these countries aren't democratic or don't have conservation as election winning issue, which means that political capital mechanism doesn't really strongly apply. And lastly, our extension usually accounts for this because these governments are otherwise the least accountable, which means there's more of an incentive to introduce private actors that they can separately hold accountable. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank the opposition. Sorry, I thank the Gov Whip. I'd like to welcome the opposition whip to close the debate.
My speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to explain why we come over OO, then I'm going to tell you why we come over CG, and then I'm going to explain why we come over OG. Quickly to whip what our extensions were and how they are different and better than OO. I think OO explains quite well why it's expensive and capital is an issue. I think what this is kind of feasibility mitigation that it might be hard to do. I think what we do and why we win is because our contribution explains the actual harm that occurs when you are buying up this land. That is the trade-off that you have. It is not just like, one or the other. By going over agricultural land, you stop people being able to feed their families. By stopping solar development, you stop the shift towards renewable, or at least slow it. Those were harms to the environment as well. The environment is something that we cared about. So I think we actually provide like a harm here And then secondly, other extension. I think what OO does is explain why it's bad now, and we agree, there is logging, there are poachers. But I think what Will's extension does very well here is to explain that how it gets worse specifically. That is, you have more land, and you have the same amount of resources, or in fact, we explain why these resources are actually much less, and why this leads to harms being much worse. Sure.
This debate does have fiat, but it's limited. Therefore, we can develop new national parks at the level of existing ones. That is within the debate. This debate is about money that will be spent into the future. Opbench needs to prove that more ranges is the tipping point for saving rhinos when it's never worked before.
I think, again, if you listen to a lot of the analysis here, sure, both sides have fear, but I think if you just listen, there is obviously a very large, millions of dollars or hundreds of millions to purchase, say even one snow resort. It's not clear how that's going to stop rhinos from being extinct. I think we provide a very large, marginal impact that happens when you explain that it's bad now and now you enforce those areas. It is not obviously you can do both, but I think it's very unreasonable to expect that you have enough capital. You can sort of focus on the current...
information.
No, thank you. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to move on to CG and what they've told us. I think firstly, CG tells us, firstly, just if you have OSPOI, it's just they kind of just knife their opening government. You don't want to develop into your areas, that is what OG tells you. I think even OG's analysis is it's going to be really bad if you spend more money in these national parks because you're going to have more development, you're going to build stuff, and that's a bad thing. On the very metrics that OG provides, that development is a bad thing. I think you just accrue a lot of harms and you kind of fall out from the debate. But let's move on from that. They kind of firstly tell us that the government is just really bad at managing it. I think firstly, this concedes that it is actually just poorly done, that these national parks are not well taken care of, that there are actually environmental harms to animals, to flora. But I think secondly, with our extension, we explain why this gets worse, because you are less able to manage. Supposedly, if this government is now managing the national park and also somehow has the specialized expertise to negotiate with a market of private firms who want to compete and then regulating the way in which they operate hydro or solar, obviously the way in which they're going to manage was going to get worse on your own weighing. This meant that all the harms that you say government is bad, the national parks are bad, only gets worse. So we kind of impact this harm more. Secondly, they tell you that private actors just won't be using these areas to create solar and things like that. Firstly, again, in my introduction, I kind of explained why with the capital, it's just going to get worse. You just probably won't be able to buy it up. But secondly, we obviously know there is a private incentive for these actors. Solar is very profitable, dams are profitable, there is a shift towards renewable. Even if you didn't believe that, the government will just subsidize these as, there is a lot of political backing behind improving the environment and going green. I think the issue with CG, it's unclear. I think also firstly, make a distinction between national parks and governments. They're actually not the same people here. It's not clear why national parks specifically have the ability or are willing to, when, as we already explained, they don't have much resources, why they will be able to operate and develop and support this private market of people for renewable or things like that. I think that explains to you that there are obviously government incentives to subsidize financial incentive for these private actors. These were going to be happening already, so it was not necessary. I won't be taking any more POIs. It wasn't necessary that you actually intervene in this case. And as our extension explains, there is a large harm that occurs when you do intervene. That is taking away the land from people in developing areas who needed it to feed their families, to develop their economy, to become a player in the global market. Okay, finally, moving on to OG. Why do our extensions come over them? I think our extension like neatly defeats their benefit of purchasing, because they tell us that it is just going to be like better because you stop this deforestation and like, you know, we stop the urban sprawl. I think it's pretty clear why this is not, or firstly, assume it is this urban areas. There's obviously property developers who, like, you know, there's a race to the bottom there. It's obviously cheap now. That would explain why there is a lot of market incentives to race to the bottom, get in there really quickly. It's expensive. But again, I explained like why there actually probably is just mostly going to be these underdeveloped land. And obviously there was also an additional cost. Say it was like agricultural land. Now you have to pay for that, changing that agricultural land into like a national park, or changing that like area like that. And I think the other thing they tell you, again, why development is bad, we explain why quality of regulation is better, because that means that each new person in that park has like close to net zero harm. We explain that each new person now accrues more harm to the environment. So at the end of this debate, you should see that CO wins because we provide a harm in acquiring this new land and a harm in these existing national parks for those reasons. So proud to oppose.